everyone. Welcome to Switchblade Sisters Social Club, the true crime podcast where two friends exploit their worst fears for your entertainment.
You're welcome.
I'm Dee, a writer and podcaster.
And I'm Isla from Criminally Good Books, a true crime and crime fiction bookshop in York.
Follow us on all the socials.
Except for X, obviously.
Or have a look at our website, switchbladesisterssocialclub.com.
Check them out for all our latest episodes, events, deals, and other weird stuff.
Listeners' discretion advised. Hi!
Hello!
Oh, I can't believe this is happening.
Neither can I.
But we are interviewing Steve Hodel, son of Dr. George Hodel, one of the prime suspects in the Black Dahlia case.
Mm-hmm.
How?
Well, because we're amazing, and particularly you're amazing. And he obviously wants to share with everyone his research and what he's done.
Well, I am really excited about it because I read his book a few years ago now, good few years ago, Black Dahlia Avenger.
You gave it to me.
I gave it to you. And available at criminallygoodbooks.co.uk. And it's phenomenal. So Steve Hodel is a retired LA homicide detective. And after his father's death in 1999, he wanted to prove his father's innocence once and for all because his father was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder case, that is the murder of Elizabeth Short, in 1947. He came on the radar of the police when he got acquitted for the sexual assault, the rape of his 13-year-old daughter. So he was acquitted of that, but it put him in the sort of crosshairs of the police because he was accused of a sexual crime against a young lady and, well, against a child, I'm going to say, but Elizabeth Short was a young female. And he had medical knowledge and basically Elizabeth Short had been bisected in a way that implied that the killer might have some medical knowledge. So it was only a couple of years after the murder that he came on the police radar. And it's only after his death that his son decided to finally clear his name, not of his other crimes. Steve never said, my dad is a saint, but he was trying to prove my dad is not the Black Dahlia killer. However, in doing so, he came to the painful conclusion, not only that his father might very well be the Black Dahlia killer, but also that his beloved LAPD that he had worked many years, decades in, that there might be signs of corruption there, that they might have contributed to covering up what happened to Elizabeth Short, but also that his father might be responsible for other murders. Because it is, we talked about this in the last episode where we went into more detail about the case. So if you need more details, then please do go listen to our previous episode and come back and join us here.
Yeah, definitely listen to that one before this one.
It's such a grim, brutal murder that it is so unlikely that that is the murderer's only crime or murder.
Right.
It's just, you don't go from zero to that.
No, absolutely not.
I don't feel like you go from that to never committing another crime unless you die, move away, go to jail, you know?
You don't go from zero to then a crime where you make no mistakes. Do you know what I mean?
And again, as a reminder, Elizabeth Short in 1947 disappeared, was found almost a week later, had clearly been held for a few days, had been found posed outside, bisected, drained of blood, mutilated, flesh removed, cleaned with gasoline. Like, it was such a bizarre case. And there were many suspects. Many were cleared. Some of them cleared in ways that they might not have been cleared if the case happened today. And just so many questions still. Steve, as I mentioned as well, is not the only child of a suspect that's come forward and said, I think my parent was actually the killer. Right. So we've had false confessions. We've had all kinds of bizarre theories. But Dr. George Hodel was one of the serious prime suspects of the police themselves. They wiretapped his phones. That's how committed they were to investigating him. A little bit more information about Steve Hodel. He had served in the U.S. Navy as a medic, and he joined the LAPD in 1963. He worked in homicide and became a detective and retired in 1986. So that's 20 plus years working for the LAPD.
Mm.
He then worked as a private investigator and then an author. He has been involved in more than 300 murder investigations, and he has an incredibly high solve rate. So this guy is like, I mean, that's literally his job, investigating murders. So it's not even,
exactly.
He's coming at it two ways: insider knowledge of the people involved and the suspect as his son, and a background of investigating homicides. He received 75 commendations during his career. So he was clearly,
good at his job.
Very well respected. Like I said in last week's episode, he'd written the Black Dahlia Avenger and then went on to write Most Evil, which follows up on some other crimes that he believes his father was involved in, including one of the main ones that is quite a common belief, even of those who don't think he's the Black Dahlia killer. He is suspected of killing his secretary. And I went into a little bit of a bio about George Hodel. He was a physician to the stars, to, Hollywood's rich and famous. He was friends with like Man Ray and a bunch of other artists and so forth. And he specialized in venereal disease and public health. So I imagine he was very busy in the Hollywood era of this time.
Yeah, he would be.
We showed a picture of his house, the Jaws house, which plays a role because the killer of the Black Dahlia needed to have had a space where they could have kept Elizabeth for a few days, hostage, basically. And this house would have suited that need. The house was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's eldest son. And as I mentioned, George Hodel lived there with his family. His daughter accused him a couple of years after the Black Dahlia killing of sexual abuse. And that is what put him on the radar with the police. He was wiretapped, and one of the most famous quotes from that wiretap, one of the most damning quotes, I should say, is where he says, like, "So what if I am the killer? They couldn't prove it now." And he even goes on to say, "They can't ask my secretary, she's dead too," which seems like a weird thing to say, unless you killed the secretary too. He left soon after suspicion was drawn to him and went to live in Hawaii and the Philippines and so forth. And he came back only in 1990 to the California area and died in 1999 at age 91 in California.
A long life.
So like I said, you have the evidence against him is that he has this medical background. Steve Hodel, his son, says that his father and Elizabeth Short actually knew each other. He says there's photographic evidence, but these photographs are disputed in the fact that they aren't very clear, apparently, and even her family are not entirely sure. They've not said it's not her. They're just not 100% sure from these photos. I don't know whether they're grainy or damaged or whatever, that it is her. So he is saying that they knew each other. No one else is really saying that. That's not to say it's not true. It's just not been backed up by anyone else. Yeah.
I'm super excited to listen to Steve. Like, even if it wasn't for everything, the Black Dahlia side of things, he sounds like an incredibly interesting person that I would love to chat to him about his life and like his job as like a murder detective. And I think that would be so fascinating. And I would love to, I don't know if he has done, like, write a book about his life in that side of things. That would be super interesting.
I know. I wonder, has he covered any other cases, for example? There's also, if you go back and listen to the previous episode, the Black Dahlia killer supposedly wrote letters to the LA Examiner newspaper. Newspaper is a loose term because it sounds like it's a pile of trash. They're the ones that called up Elizabeth Short's mother, pretending Elizabeth had won a beauty pageant, and basically got loads of information out of her about Elizabeth for this article, or, and then said, haha, just joking. I don't know if they said it like that.
Yeah, they might not have gone, haha.
I like to think they weren't that cruel, but they told her, no, she's not actually won anything. She's actually been brutally murdered.
Yeah, but we just got the information that we wanted from you.
But that newspaper, that newspaper got messages and parcels of items and so forth, supposedly from the killer. Seems like it could be someone who definitely knows a lot more about the murder than was released to the public, like how things were cleaned and so forth.
Mm.
And Steve says that handwriting matches his father's. Again, that's something that's been criticized as too weak to be conclusive, you know?
It'd be good to just chat about that more.
Yeah. And then also where Steve loses some people, where they criticize him, and we'll talk to him about this, is where he extrapolates from saying my father is the Black Dahlia killer and got away with that murder to my father is a serial killer and got away with multiple
other murders. Okay.
Yeah, because obviously that's a lot of either incompetency or corruption on the police force side. So without further ado, let's bring Steve on.
Please. Okay. Steve, welcome. My first question is, what is the one thing about the Black Dahlia case that you think the public still fundamentally misunderstand or don't really truly know or appreciate?
Oh gosh, to try and limit it to one is not going to be easy. Perhaps, one of the problems with the crime itself is it's gone through so much myth from 1947 when it occurred. It's developed into as you probably well know, there's been 6 or 8 suspects come up. It's because of the absolute horror of the crime and the uniqueness. It became LAPD's most infamous unsolved crime.
Right.
And myth unfolded through the decades. So there's so many points there. One of the big myths, of course, is the missing week. They talk about Elizabeth Short, the victim, going into the Biltmore Hotel on the 9th of January and then exiting out into the fog and not seen until the body was found on the 15th. Absolutely untrue. Once I got into my investigation, I was able to come up with actually 14 witnesses during that entire week who saw her every day of that week.
Wow.
And in what capacity? Just going about her own day?
Between Hollywood and downtown, each day somebody ran into her, and actually 7 of the 14 witnesses actually knew her, so they couldn't have been mistaken. But again, that's part of the myth and lore. And of course, another big myth was that the case was never solved. And in fact, my investigation discovered that it actually was solved back then. And we could talk about the cover-up later. So I didn't really solve the case myself. All I did was discover that they had solved it back then. And basically, so those are 2 of the major myths. But, it's unfolded into so many directions that it's hard to be specific about any one because there's so much false information about her out there.
Exactly.
I think, like you say, a myth and a lore and a legend, isn't it now?
Mm.
Yes.
I think it would be great to go into the cover-up in a little bit as well. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
We definitely have questions prepared about that. So I was telling Isla, and we were discussing earlier, that by no means did you mean to go out to prove that your father was a saint originally, but just that he was innocent of this crime. And through your research, as you said, you discovered these cover-ups and a whole bunch of other stuff that you were unaware of at the time. But not only that, so this is sort of, the difficulty of going against a family member, regardless of your relationship with that person, but also your history working with the LAPD. There must have been a sort of conflict there or dilemma there, sort of highlighting their, flaws or their incompetencies in the best case and the corruption at the worst case. What did it cost you personally to pursue this theory and so publicly?
Yeah. Well, maybe I should give you a little bit of my background in regards to that, which would probably help to answer your question. Just so your listeners know, basically, my years were from 1963 until 1986 is when I retired. So 24 years on LAPD. The first first 6 years were in patrol, uniform patrol, working the streets of various, we call them divisions. I don't know I think you call them precincts or whatever, but working different divisions, went through the original Watts riots. Then I went into detectives in 69 and worked all of the different tables. Juvenile, initially as a young detective, worked juvenile table, burglary, auto theft, robbery, sex crimes, and then eventually graduated to homicide. And I worked the homicide table for 17 years at Hollywood Division, 300 murder investigations, had an exceptionally high solve rate, was running around 75 to 80% solved. And it wasn't just me. I had great partners, and the spirit to core was very strong there. So of all the 18 divisions in LAPD at that time, we were right up there at the top on solving crimes. And then I retired in 86 and got my private investigator's license and started working defense cases, criminal defense. So, 24 years up for prosecution, and then the next 20, 25 years would be doing defense work for private attorneys in LA. And then I moved up to Washington State, worked for the public defender's office. So I had a great reputation on LAPD. And as you know, this case came to me. I didn't go to it. And I was living and retired, semi-retired in Bellingham, Washington. And I got that 2 a.m. phone call from my father's wife, June, and she was in San Francisco. She was hysterical and said, "Your father's collapsed. The paramedics are here. They've just pronounced him dead." So I flew down and did all the things that you do to a son does to take care of his father's passing. And basically that began my investigation. I'm sitting there with June, and she comes out and she brings this small book. And she says, "I think your father would want you to have this." And I'm going through it, and it has family pictures and of me. And then I come to a photograph of a young woman. And can you see this?
Is this the photograph?
Yes. And I say, "June, who is this?" And she says, "I don't know, somebody your father knew from a long time ago." And to this day, I can't explain it, but Black Dahlia comes and goes in my mind. It just passes through briefly. Now, I'm not sure why that happened. It could have been as a young child. I was 6 years old at the time of the murder in 47. It could have been that something I had heard back then as a boy. I have no reason, but it came and went. I didn't give any thought to it. And then a day or two later, I'm on the phone notifying my family members and stuff. And I'm talking to my half-sister, Tamar, same father, in Hawaii. And we're on the phone, and I'm saying, we're talking about the great man, June. His wife always called him the great man. So we're talking about the great man's passing and what a remarkable life he had. And she says, "Well, Steve, he was a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder." And I'm saying, "What are you talking about, Tamar? Where is this coming from? What do you mean he was a suspect?" She says, "Well, he didn't do it, but when I was in custody and juvenile detention, the detectives that took me to the trial, of course, he had been arrested for incest with her in 49, and they said that they thought he was a killer of the Black Dahlia." She says, "He didn't do it, but they thought he did." And I said, "Well, that's ridiculous. I'll be able to show this. He had nothing with my background. I'll be able to establish he had nothing to do with it in 10 minutes. And I was close to my father, and that's what really started me off on the investigation to show he had nothing to do with it. And here we are 26 years later and 9 books. And it took me in exactly the opposite direction. So that's a long answer to your question. But basically, I think it's good to have that as a background. Also, if you want, it's important to understand who George Hill Hodel was. And at some point now or later, I can give you a running background on his life, because it's important. The first third of my book is backgrounding him and the family story.
Yeah. We covered some of his background, his bio and so forth, and how he sort of crossed a few social circles, let's say, being doctor as well as being very involved in sort of boho actors and the Hollywood glam side of things, Man Ray. So he must have been a very interesting character. Was he as charismatic as the photo that you sent implies? This is the question I had.
He was more so. He had that ability. He'd walk into a room and you'd almost feel like you were in the presence of someone really special, the Pope or something. And he would silently take command of a room. He had that ability. And he was, he had a beautiful speaking voice, kind of a Richard Burton type of voice. And he had this, mind that was a universal mind that as you probably have mentioned, he had 186 IQ, 1 point above Einstein. And incidentally, that skips a generation, but my boys are in good shape. But, he did have that command presence and the voice, and he could speak on any subject. So, yes, he was extremely charismatic. Women immediately fell in love with him just being in his presence. He had that ability.
It's making me quite emotional because I'm a daddy's girl. I'm also very close to my father. And I can't imagine the head fuck of having to come to these conclusions about your own father, basically. And I want to go back to the photo you just showed us because we talked a lot about whether or not your father had met Elizabeth Short and how there was debate, and some of your critics have said that it's not her in the photos or you can't be certain it's her in the photo. And it looked a lot like her.
Well, there has been a lot of controversy. Half the world says it's not her. There's no way. It's not even close. The other half says, yeah, I think it is her. So I had, basically I did the forensics on it. I checked out to find one of the top leading forensic examiners. And actually I went to Germany, and there was a lab called BioID who had one of the top reputations in Europe. And I sent him known photographs of Elizabeth Short and the photograph itself. We'll call her what I refer to her as George Hodel's Jane Doe photo. He did a comparison, and he came back initially with a 95% probability that it's Elizabeth Short, forensically speaking. And then about a year later, 2 years later, he came back and recontacted me and says, actually, with the new equipment and stuff, it's gone up to about 97, 98% probability that it's Elizabeth Short.
I'm guessing they never say 100%. So that's basically as
they require a 99.7% for an actual positive.
Oh.
And of course, we're dealing with a photograph that's 60, 70 years old. But, still, that's extremely high. Basically, it's positive for her. But it wasn't just the facial recognition itself. There was, of course, the earrings, too. And in my newer books, I updated it, and I include that as corroboration. And what you see on the posed George Hodel Jane Doe photo, you see a pearl earring on her ear. And in the autopsy photos of Elizabeth Short, close up, you see a pearl earring placed inside the ear. And I make the point that that's part of his posing, goes along with his posing. I believe that in that photograph, she's either unconscious or dead. And I believe it was a death trophy posing, if you will. She's leaning up against a chair in the living room of the Sowden house, the Hodel Franklin house. And I believe this was pre-bisection, obviously, pre-torture. And
so you actually recognized the location of the photo?
Well, yes, and I make comparisons to the chair, to known photographs I have of the living room where there's a chair, an upholstered chair, and I compare that backing to what she's leaning up against. And there's no question that he took the photograph, of course, and it was during that time period at the Sowden house. So we have that. There's also the lipstick I go into that too in detail. I do close-ups of the lipstick, and no woman's going to put lipstick on like you see it there. Again, I relate that to some of Man Ray's, his good friend Man Ray's photographs of the Les Amoureux, the lips that are floating across the horizon. This was all part of it. And his, as I'm sure you may have mentioned in your backgrounding, his pathology was surrealism, whereas Man Ray and Duchamp and Copley all talk the talk. They drank their red wine and talked the talk. I believe George walked the walk. He actually believed there was no difference between the dream and the wakeful reality state. So I think that, that I go into a lot of the different posing at the crime scene, and the whole bisection, as you know, was, I believe, an imitation of Man Ray's Minotaur. And there's cuttings on the body, which I've just come out. I don't know if you're aware of this, but I've just come out with a new book, literally 2 months ago, called As Within, So Without. Are you familiar with that?
No, not at all. No,
we'll
tell
make it
us.
available at Criminally Good Books.
It'll be available at Criminally Good Books if you give me the details.
Well, as you know, I've written now 8 books, and I'm presenting the fact that he was a serial killer, not just the one Elizabeth Short, but a series of what I call L.A. lone woman murders.
Yes.
There were about 9 or 10 murders in L.A. in a close geographical pattern, and I present those cases as all connected. And I believe he started in 1943 in L.A. on those, and they went through 1950 when he fled the country and left for Hawaii and then on to Manila. So we have the L.A. lone woman murders, and they present the who, what, when, and where of it all.
And what is the name of the book again, Steve? And do you have it in front of you? Okay.
Can you see it?
As Within, So Without. Oh, and you've got the picture of. Oh, yeah. Wow.
Amazing.
Yeah, I did not know about that one.
This book is the why, and it's all the surrealist linkage in detail, and it goes through it. It's more of I'll say coffee table book, but it's not exactly that. But it focuses on it strictly focuses on the why. It doesn't go into all of the rest of the crimes and stuff, and it shows the close link that the close friendship that Dad had with Man Ray and Copley, who were close friends for that decade. Man Ray was in Hollywood. His Hollywood years were from 1940 to 1950 or 51. And Dad was very close to Man Ray. You've probably seen a number of the family photographs, the Hodel photographs that Man Ray's taken of my mother and us boys and father. So basically, this focuses on the why, and it's quite different from my previous 8 or 9 books, which are more go into the criminal details of the who, what, when, where.
It sounds fascinating. Do you think that your father wanted to be, I don't know if accepted is the right word, within that sort of artistic community? Do you think there was that was a part of it?
Very, very much so.
Right, okay.
George Hodel wanted to be an artist. Initially he had, as a young man, of course, he started his own magazine called Fantasia, which was if you will, a surrealist magazine for the elite, the uninitiated, uninformed, need not apply type of thing. And again, I don't know how you said you've gone into some of his background, but his formative years as a young man, I think, are extremely important to understand in the sense that of what he became.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want me to give a little summary on his early years? Because
definitely
formative years are the trouble years.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, George Hodel was born in Los Angeles in 1907. He was a piano prodigy at the age of 9, playing his own piano concerts at the Shrine Auditorium. Rachmaninoff came to the family home and sat and listened to him play. My grandparents, his mother and father, were Russian Jews. They fled Russia the turn of the century. Basically, well, actually, His mother was a dentist in Paris, France in 1901. Very unusual. Can you imagine a woman dentist in 1901? Highly unusual, highly intelligent. Rumors are, the word is that she came from royalty. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't been able to establish that, but her name was Leov, Leov, from Odessa. And George Sr., grandfather, fled Russia just before he was about to be conscripted into the army. And he escaped. He wrote an essay, which I print in one of my books called Escape, where he took a train and was able to get out of the country. His original name was Goldgifter, and he just assumed the name Hodel, which I think is fairly common, but it's a known, I believe, Swiss name. Went to Paris, met Esther. They fell in love, came through Ellis Island in early 1903 or 4, I think it was. Came to Los Angeles and had their only son born. George Jr., George Hill Hodel, was born. And he grew up in kind of the Pasadena area. Not only was he a musical prodigy, but he was also highly gifted, highly intelligent, with a very high IQ. Entered Caltech University at the age of 14.
Wow.
2 years.
That
Yeah.
I did not know. I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah, Caltech. He was going to be a chemical engineer. Not only was he highly intellectually gifted and musically gifted, he was also sexually precocious, if you will, and had an affair with a professor's wife at Caltech. She got pregnant, broke up her marriage. She went back east, had the girl child, which she aptly named Folly. Young George, still a teen, of course, went back and said, "I love you. I want to marry you." And the woman says, "George, you're a child yourself. Get out of my life. Go away. I never want to see you again." He comes back to Los Angeles, passes himself off for 21 at 17. He drives cab for a short time, a year or so, and then he gets a job as a journalist with the LA Record, which was one of the large newspapers of the day, writing crime stories. He becomes a journalist. He's riding around with LAPD Vice. And back then, of course, it was Prohibition. And he's riding around with Vice, and they're kicking doors and arresting the judge with a young blonde type of thing. And then he graduates and starts riding around with LAPD Homicide, the detectives, and going to these crime scenes and writing these tabloid type stories, the bloody ace of diamonds next to the body, that sort of thing. And then he's with the Record for about a year, and then he leaves and starts his own magazine called Fantasia. And from there, he goes on and basically is double dating with John Huston, who at that time wasn't the famous director. He was just the son of Walter Huston, who was a famous screen and stage actor. And so John and George are double dating. And George is dating a woman named Dorothy Harvey, and John is dating a woman named Emilia. They're double dating. And then suddenly, after a number of weeks, they switch, and John falls in love with Dorothy. They run off to New York, Greenwich Village, get married, and George and Emilia look at each other, and George says, like, "I guess it's you and me, babe." She's pregnant. They go north. Dad goes through pre-med at Berkeley, and then across the bay to UCSF San Francisco, gets his medical degree, has an affair with another woman who has another child named, well, first Emilia has a child named Duncan, who's born to them. Then he has an affair with another woman and another Dorothy, not the first Dorothy. And they have a daughter named Tamar, who's born in 35. He gets his medical degree in 36, does doctoring for a year at the General Hospital there, then decides he needs some space from the two small children and the two women, and he takes off and starts doctoring and becomes the sole surgeon at a logging camp in New Mexico, Arizona. Does that for a year as a surgeon there, then goes on to New Mexico and starts doctoring to the Hopi and Navajo Indian reservations, does that. And then now we're in the late 30s. He comes back to LA, joins LA County Health Department. The original Dorothy with Houston, it's now 7 years later. They divorce. She comes back to LA, hooks back up with George, and they get married. And my older brother Mike is born in 39. I come along at 41. My other brother Kelvin comes along at 42. Dad quickly rises on LA County Health Department, becomes the VD czar, specializing in venereal disease control, and becomes the VD czar of LA County. He buys the famous Sowden House, which is a historic monument, if you will.
We talked about it and shared the photo. Yeah, it's impressive.
Right. And we called it the Franklin House, but it's the Sowden House. And so Dad's the king, Mom's the queen. We're the three little princes running around in the house, and we're there from 45 to 50. And then suddenly Dad's gone. He's in the wind. We know nothing as boys. We know nothing about the trial or the arrest or the charges for incest or anything. All we know is Dad's gone. And that begins what I call the gypsy years, where Mom and we are bounce all around LA for the next 5-7 years.
Love a good murder? Come visit me, Isla, at Crimley Good Books in York, your one-stop shop for crime fiction and true crime reads, as well as gifts and author events. Or browse online at crimleygoodbooks.co.uk.
Anyway, that's kind of a long-winded version of you get a sense of who he was. And there's a lot of naysayers to my writings and who say, oh, he was never a surgeon. He was a surgeon. He was a soul surgeon for more than a year, highly skilled. And of course, that's one of the big points in the crime itself is they were absolutely convinced it had to be a highly skilled person with high skills, not a butcher, it had to be a skilled surgeon. In fact, the doctor, the coroner, that medical examiner that did the autopsy says, I couldn't do as good a job as whoever did this. This is highly skilled, and several other physicians have made the same findings. They said it's actually, you probably touched on this, it's actually called there's an operation called a hemicorporectomy, which is actually what it was. It's done between the second and the third lumbar vertebrae. And it's the only way you can divide a body without sawing through bone. And so it was a procedure that it actually wasn't done as a life-saving procedure until the 50s. But in medical school in 1936, when George was performing autopsies and doing surgery in medical school, it was used to divide the body on autopsies. So it was a procedure that was known and done back then. It just wasn't a life-saving procedure until much later. And
there was also a knowledge of forensics, the cleaning of different elements that were found at the crime scene and so forth, that I'm not surprised that you're talking about his background in sort of covering crime. He was better placed to sort of have an understanding about that. We take it for granted now. We all know about fingerprints and DNA and blah, 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 and we watch it on TV, but this is the 1940s. And so it might have been less in the sort of forefront of people's minds to be so careful about covering your tracks and to be able to do it so expertly.
Yes. And of course, he did different markings on the body that I connect to surrealist works of Man Ray, besides the Minotaur and the L'Amoureux, the lover's lips. He also did some unique cuttings. Also, of course, one of the myths is, and you'll hear, again, my naysayers say there were no burn marks to the body. And one of the amazing things that I came across in my investigation was I was contacted by the granddaughter of Harry Hansen. Now, Harry Hansen was the detective, one of the two detectives, along with Finus Brown, that was in charge of the investigation that responded to the original crime scene. And Harry Hansen's granddaughter contacted me and said, I have some photographs here that I've, discovered from my grandfather's. He saved them. He brought them home. And would you be interested in seeing them? And I said, yeah. So we met in Los Angeles, and there were a bunch of crime scene photographs and autopsy photographs, many of which had already been published. But there was one photograph that she gave me that showed the 9 cigarette or cigar burn marks on the back. And this was one of the supposed secrets, I guess, that they held back from the public. And oftentimes we do this for polygraph reasons. In other words, if someone confesses and they have no knowledge that cigarette burns were done on the back, then of course that's what we call a polygraph secret.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you said that your father may have been protected due to connections with the LAPD and sort of powerful figures. What's the strongest evidence?
In regards to the cover-up?
Absolutely. And what would you say the strongest evidence is that it was corruption and not just sort of police incompetence or, whatever? It would be really great to sort of go into that, if you wouldn't mind, if you feel that this is the right time to go through that. It'd be really interesting to hear.
Yeah. Well, what happened was they were having all of these LA lone woman murders in the 40s, and LAPD wasn't solving any of them. So in 1949, the 1949 grand jury said, none of these crimes are being solved. LAPD is not doing their work. They actually took away the Black Dahlia investigation from LAPD, and they said, we want the district attorney's office to investigate. Now, these are separate offices. There's the LAPD, the police department, and the district attorney's office, which is completely separate from it. And they said, we want the DA's office to investigate these. And they put a man in charge, a Lieutenant Jemison. Frank Jemison was placed in charge. And he immediately assembled a team of investigators, not 9 investigators. And they decided to do a stakeout. George Hodel had become a prime suspect in the case. And LAPD said, well, wait a minute, we want to be part of this. And so they acquiesced, and another team of 9 detectives from LAPD joined them. So you had a team of 18 detectives. And what they did was they picked up George Hodel in 1950, and they early in February, or January, I guess it was. No, it was February of 50. And they took him in and took him downtown and started questioning him about the crime. And while he was held downtown, they went out and they actually broke into the Sowden house, our home, and they put microphones in the walls, not phone taps, but actual microphones in the walls. And they ran a hard line through the basement, connected it to the telephone line, ran that all the way to Hollywood Detectives, where I had worked for 17 years. They set up 2 chairs in the basement, and they started recording.
Steve, this is a lot of money that was spent on this, right? Was that quite unusual, having the DA then taking over and then having 2 different groups of people working on it, the sheer amount of manpower, planning and cost that would have been? Someone high up must have thought, this is it. We're going to put all our eggs in one basket.
And it was run by this DA who had no connection to LAPD. He was just doing his job and was an outstanding investigator. And yes, it's very expensive to do this. Of course, back then there were no, they didn't really follow the rules or law. You didn't have to get today, of course, you'd have to get a warrant. You'd have to establish probable cause before you even went up. They went and jimmied the door was locked, and they actually jimmied the door, went in, placed the microphones in, one in the bedroom, one in the living room, and started recording 24/7 around the clock, 2-man teams sitting in the basement of Hollywood Station. And basically they started recording it, and they recorded for 5 weeks, 24/7. And what did they get? They got some very damning statements, of course. And I don't know if you've covered these or not, but if you want, I'll read some of the recordings from some of the days just to give you an idea.
Yes, please. We did cover them a bit, but we would love to hear.
Okay,
you
so
think are the
I'll
most
just
important?
read from, this is kind of a summary of some of the admissions and stuff from the tape. So the tape's rolling. It started on February 15th, but they had trouble with the microphones. They didn't actually get it rolling until February 18th, 1950. And what do they get? They're listening in. George Hodel is talking to a friend, Baron Haringa, who I identified later on. He says, "This is the best payoff I've seen between law enforcement. You don't have the right connections made in the DA's office. Don't confess ever. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't prove it now because my secretary is dead." And in 1945, several years before, they investigated him for the possible forced overdose death of his secretary, Ruth Spalding. And
We
I
covered that a bit, yeah.
I don't know if you covered that, but Ruth was his secretary and she died of an overdose. It was listed as a suicide, but I present a strong case that it was a forced overdose. And I present my mother was actually called to the scene while she was still alive at her apartment. And George gave her some writings that Ruth had made, said, "Take these home and burn them. Don't read them." And mother complied. She took the writings, Ruth's writings, home and put them in the furnace and burned them. He goes on to say, "The FBI were over to see me 3 weeks ago. Don't say anything on the phone." And he thought the phone was tapped. He says, "It's tapped. I'll have to go outside to talk to you." So he suspected the phone was tapped. He had no clue that the place was wired for sound.
The whole house was tapped, basically.
Yeah, really. "I'm in trouble." And he mentions Black Dahlia. He mentions his passport. He says, "The police have a picture of me and that girl. I thought I had destroyed all of them." Now, that picture could either refer to the one in the album, or it could refer to, I think more likely to Maddie Comfort, who was a close friend and a paramour of George's. Actually, she was sexually involved with both my mother and father. Mother was bisexual, and she had an ongoing affair for a number of years with George. The cops had actually recovered a photograph of George and Maddie in the nude. So I suspect that might have been the photo he's referring to, but I'm not sure. And then he's talking to a Hodel talking to a woman about his downtown clinic. The woman mentions having had a garrettment, which is the old term for an abortion. And George says, I've done lots of them at my clinic. So, of course, committing an abortion back then was also a felony. Then he talks about the actual overdose of his murder of his secretary. He says, "I put a pillow over her head and covered her with a blanket, got a taxi, called Georgia Street Receiving Hospital right away. She expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary." And so basically what we have here is admissions and confessions to the crime itself. One of the most disturbing things I came across in this, it's a 146-page transcript. And this was hidden. This was not in LAPD's custody. LAPD, today's LAPD, or yesterday's, if you will, had no clue that George Hodel was even a suspect in the crime. His name was not in any LAPD files. And the only way we discovered this was just before my book came out back in 2003. It was about to publish. And 6 months before it came out, I had gone to LAPD. And I said, "I've conducted an investigation. I'd like to meet and give a briefing to the homicide detectives on what I've discovered." And they kept putting me off. They said, "Well, okay, we'll set one up." And the months go by, recontact him. And I had submitted this to the district attorney who reviews cases before they're filed, and met with him and given him all of my evidence and investigation. And he reviewed it for about 4 months and basically came up with a well, Steve, he says, I reviewed it all. And he says, you're probably, and this included a lot of the lone woman murders. He says, you're probably right about most of these. But he said, my filing rate my bar is very high. He says, and after reviewing it, I would file on the Black Dahlia murder, Elizabeth Short, and I would file on the murder that occurred 3 weeks later, the Jean French murder, which was she was a woman that was murdered and posed on a vacant lot about 5 miles west of the Dahlia crime scene. He says, I would file on those two, and I would win it in front of a jury trial based on your evidence. He says, you're probably right about the others, but he says, there's not enough there to file. So with that, the two of us contacted LAPD and said, we want to present our case before the book comes out. And they kept putting us off and putting us off. And finally, April of 2003 came, the book was published, and we still hadn't been able to get a meeting with LAPD. So book comes out, and I had given the information to a guy named Steve Lopez, who was a top reporter, journalist for the Los Angeles Times. And he had done a couple of quick articles on it, quick and dirty articles about. The first article came out and said, well, as Hodel comes up and he says his father is the Black Dahlia killer, da-da-da. And he went to, but before he published the articles, he went to LAPD, said, hey, Hodel claims his daddy did it, da-da-da. And LAPD says, we don't talk about unsolved cases, go away. So being a good, thorough reporter, he goes to the DA's office and says, Hodel, daddy's the Black Dahlia killer, blah, blah, blah. And the DA says to him, well, I'm not spending a dime of taxpayers' money on a 60-year-old whodunit case. But he says, there is a box in the vault downstairs in our office that contains a box on the Black Dahlia. Would you like to see it? You imagine Lopez says, yeah. They go downstairs, unlock the vault. Lopez is given the box. He goes back upstairs, opens up the box, opens up the file, and out falls a photograph of Dr. George Hill Hodel. He says, whoa, he was a suspect. Anyway, he goes quickly through the files and comes out with a second article. Well, his father was a suspect in the case, blah, blah, blah. But it was quick and dirty, and he moved on to the next thing. I contacted DA and said, well, can I see the files? He says, well, I let him. I guess I should let you too. So he did. I go down. I spend the entire day copying all of the DA files, this 146-page transcript of the secret recordings, a bunch of other files. I review it for 4 months and basically present it finally we get an appointment. We present it to the LAPD brass, the top brass, deputy chiefs, and also the detectives that currently work in homicide. And basically they come back with we're too busy to, actually the chief of detectives says to his men, go ahead and clear the crime based on Hodel's investigation. Unless you can find something, a big hole in it, go ahead and clear his investigation. Well, the detectives assigned to it in homicide, they we're too busy. We're working on other current cases and stuff. And they've been too busy for the last 20 years to take a look at it. So that's kind of where we stand. As far as the cover-up, I'm reviewing the transcripts and I'm going through it. And there's this, I'm reading the transcripts, and it says, Hodel and the Baron, this Baron Haringa, go downstairs. Blows are heard. A woman screams. More blows. A woman screams again. And it goes silent. And then there's silence. And I'm reading this and I'm saying, they're sitting there 6 minutes away from the house at Hollywood Station. Why aren't they out the door in their car over and doing a rescue? They do nothing. And I'm convinced certainly it was at least a serious felony assault. And more likely, I'm convinced it was a murder. Because after the blows are heard, we hear him say, don't leave a trace of anything. So, and also I find documents by the DA where they suspect that there might be bodies buried in the basement. this is actually their document that says they interview a plumber who was in the basement, and they say to him, "Did you see any signs of any graves or any digging?" And the plumber says, in this document, the plumber says, "I was there just to fix the plumbing. I wasn't looking for anything else."
Can I ask, though, just quickly, why are they wiretapping the whole house if they don't plan on doing anything with any of the evidence that they find?
Well, they were planning. The DA's office was planning to prosecute. In fact, Lieutenant Jemison put his case together, and he was going to file the case against George Hodel. And he's called in by the district attorney and said, "All right, you're off the case. I want you to return everything, all of the tape recordings, all of the transcripts and everything, return it to Deputy Chief Thad Brown of LAPD. You're off the case. We're turning it back to them." And so basically, it was a shutdown. He was removed. Jemison, the only guy wearing a white hat, so to speak, was immediately removed from the case, and it was all returned back. He was ordered to return it back and personally hand deliver it to Chief of Detectives Thad Brown. He does this, but what he also does is, unbeknownst to anybody, he keeps a second set of books, and he locks them away in the vault, which is what we would find 60 years later. So basically, George Hodel was untouchable. He had grown up in LA just as Thad Brown. And all of this goes back to my later publications, which is I call the early years. And there are two books. I thought it would be one book, but the early years crimes. Dad didn't wake up at age 40 and say, "I think I'll be a serial killer." So I knew there must have been crimes before. And sure enough, my books, I present the case that George actually started out at the age of 14. His first murder, I believe, was the shooting of a priest, the kidnapping and shooting of a priest in San Francisco in 1921 at the age of 14. Of course, he was 14 going on 35 with his mental abilities. That was the first crime, and I believe he never stopped. I present totally in toto, I present 50 crimes in 50 years. The early years, book one covers the 1920s. Book two covers the 1930s. And in the 1930s, Thad Brown is a lieutenant. Back then, he's a lieutenant of police. And he puts together a case against a young man with an IQ of 70, a crossing guard. And he winds up accusing him of murder. There's a trial. It was a murder of what they call the Inglewood Babes. 3 little girls were kidnapped and murdered back then, and was a sensational case. And he puts together a supposed case on this crossing guard who helped them walk across the street and claims he did it. They have a quick trial. He's found guilty and he's executed. And this crime, I present strong evidence that this crime was committed by George Hodel and an accomplice who we don't have time to talk about, Fred Sexton, who I believe was an accomplice in a number of the murders and probably the Dahlia too. So, yeah. Go ahead.
We were talking about that obviously there are people with other theories about who's committed the Black Dahlia murder, but what a lot of people do get on board with is the unlikelihood that the Black Dahlia killing was the perpetrator's sole crime because of the nature of it. It seems unlikely that someone would go from 0 to 100 and escalate to such a gruesome crime and then nothing thereafter either. And so I cannot wait. I have to admit, I haven't read these other books, and I can't wait to get stuck into them because it would be fascinating to see how they're connected. Isla, I think you wanted to bring it round again to Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Short.
I just wanted to ask you about Elizabeth. So, I mean, we often see in true crime that sort of victims turn into stories, and it's quite easy to sort of sell books on images and things either about the victims or about, the perpetrators. What's the one thing about Elizabeth Short that you think gets lost in the obsession with her death in the case? Is there anything about Elizabeth that you think that people don't know, gets lost, gets forgotten, misinterpreted?
Well, yeah, again, there's a lot of myth surrounding her. And basically, Elizabeth Short, was from Medford, Massachusetts. She quit high school and started dating military men. Elizabeth was, as I see it, was a young lady who wanted to basically fall in love with a military man, get married, and live happily ever after. She dated a lot of military men. She just basically was a child of the war years. World War II had just was ongoing and had just ended. And she had a number of affairs with a number of military men, none of which really worked out. She was really a lost soul as I see her. She bounced around. She was very transient in nature. She never wanted to be a lot of these fictional accounts of her wanting to be an actress and stuff are not true. I think probably where it came from was the men probably said to her, you're so beautiful, you should be in the movies, that sort of thing. But it wasn't coming from her, it was coming from more likely from them. And I see her as, I'm not quite sure why it didn't work out for her with her relationships, but they seem to be fairly short-lived. She had no money. She was basically homeless, if you will, once she got out to Los Angeles. And of course, she was taken in she's staying in a movie house overnight, and she's taken in by a young woman who worked there, and she stayed with her for a month and her mother, and then came back up to Los Angeles. And I see her as quite a tragic, lost child, and none of the glamour and that's attributed to her later on, I believe, was at all true. And then she meets George. Incidentally, as far as the photograph being her or not her, we can throw the photograph out if you will, although I'm convinced, and forensics are convinced it's her, because the DA reports clearly established that Lieutenant Jemison documents that they knew each other. He interviews my mother in an interview in February or March of, I think it was March of 1950. And he clearly states in that transcribed interview that says, George Hodel and Elizabeth Short knew each other, were acquainted, and dated. So that's established that George Hodel knew her. And I think that, there's another part that was quite surprising to me. A lot of the myth paint her as sort of a virginal woman who really had no sex with anybody, and they go off into some rather crazy extremes in regards to her sex life. And I was quite surprised because in the DA reports, I discovered that actually, and we don't have time to talk about it, but one of those serial crimes my father committed, and I present the case, is the lipstick murders in Chicago, which predated the Dahlia murder. And I'm able to connect through a lot of circumstantial evidence. I make a strong case that he actually committed those. Again, a young teenager was arrested for those and charged, and no trial. He was sent. He pled guilty under threat of being executed, and was sent immediately to prison, where he spent the next 64 years and died in prison. And I went back and actually interviewed him, and totally innocent man, and not just Steve Hodel saying it. A whole lot of other people say he was innocent. Anyway, Elizabeth Short is documented that she actually went back to Chicago while George was in China for a number of months. And she began kind of investigating on her own the Chicago lipstick murders. And there's a reason for this, but we don't have time to probably go into all of it. But there's a connection with George, and who identified himself as a Chicago police officer and had a badge. And while he was with her in going to a radio show in Los Angeles, he pulls out the badge, and they're allowed to break line and go into the show.
We need to get you back on to talk about this case for sure. So you've teased us too much about it. So please come back to talk to us about that.
Okay. So basically, she goes back to Chicago in 1946, and she's investigating the Chicago murders on her own, and she's talking to reporters and newsmen. And I'm reading the DA report on it, and she's actually sleeping. She actually slept with 3 different newsmen at different times back there, which kind of surprised me. They actually document the fact that they were interviewed and actually said, yeah, I slept with her. So these 3 different men. So for whatever reasons, and that kind of shed a bit of a different light on it. And maybe she was more open, and maybe there was more involvement than we actually know. But she was a tragic figure, no question about it. And basically, I think she was just looking to fall in love with Lieutenant Wright and live happily ever after was her story.
We talked about when we were going through her sort of life story that you get this sense of, yes, definitely a tragic figure, not just because obviously she was brutally murdered so young, but also the sense of independence. She moving around a lot is hard at any age and any gender at any time period, but for a young female in this time period to be moving cross country and starting again every time, that takes some fortitude. And then we also talked a little bit about the wordings used to describe her. We're very used to seeing, some victim blaming going on. There was quotes from the papers about her prowling Hollywood Boulevard. Actually, she'd lived on Hollywood Boulevard. We were talking about how she was probably just running errands, not really prowling, So again, she gets lost in this myth and legend. And
Right.
We really just wanted to kind of end with a bit of a focus on her. But I do want to ask you, because you mentioned that you had a really high solve rate and you'd been working on sort of 300 different homicide cases in your career at the LAPD. Is there a case that you think that we should cover on the podcast?
Well, let me think. Back in my day, most of our murders were prostitutes were the victims, oftentimes pimp murders, drug-related murders, nothing of, basically it was just it was a very transient, it was a different time, we're talking about the late 60s and the early 70s in Hollywood. And there were the love-ins, there was, it was the hippie movement. So most of our victims were transient types, were nothing of really high profile. Any of the really high profile cases were handled by downtown robbery homicide. They would take over. I did have one of my early cases it wasn't a murder. It was an attempt. It was almost a murder. It was an attempt murder, a kidnap of a little girl. And it was in the early 70s. And does the name Rodney Alcala mean anything to you?
The dating game show.
Yes. And this was pre-discovery of all of his murders. He committed this crime. He kidnapped this little girl off the streets of Hollywood, took her to his apartment, and raped her and hit her over the head with a steel bar. And a witness saw him go into his apartment with her, and he called the police. He thought, this doesn't look right. And the police respond. They door knock the door. Alcala comes to the door with his just pair of pants on, says yes. And they said, we want to talk to you. He says, okay, let me get a shirt on. I'll be right with you. So they're waiting outside, and they're waiting, and they're waiting. No response. They knock again. Finally, they kick the door, go in. She's lying there in a large pool of blood, this 8-year-old girl, and he's in the wind. He's gone. I get the case. I put it together, get a felony warrant out for him, and he's in the wind for 2 years, finally he's arrested back east and taken into custody by the FBI. He's a counselor at a girls' summer camp. And I fly back, extradite him, bring him back to Los Angeles, and we're going to prosecute him. I had gotten a charge of attempt murder and sexual assault on the little girl. And, well, turns out the victim, this little girl, is now in Mexico. And her parents say, we're not bringing her back. We're not going to put her through all of that trauma of a trial and stuff. So we're forced to take a plea bargain with Alcala. But back then they had what you call an indeterminate sentencing. And we agreed to take a plea bargain of 1 to 99 years. So it was an indeterminate sentencing. And I figured, well, he'll have to serve at least 20 years for the crimes. So he goes off to prison. I go on to my next case, and it's not for another, 4 or 5 years. He winds up getting out after 2.5 years. The prison shrink says, I've examined him. He's all well. He's cured. He's good to go. They release Alcala after less than 3 years. And of course, you know what happened after that.
I don't.
So that was, again, the system failed us in that respect, where he certainly should have done at least 20 years for the crime. She almost died. So that's,
Well, you did your bit, Steve. You did your bit, and you are a legend in that respect. Unfortunately, it just didn't go the way that it should have.
Yeah.
I will cover that case for you one day, Isla. It is
please.
Shocking and horrendous. Isla, I think you've got a final question for Steve. We could talk to you all evening. I just find it fascinating.
Absolutely could. I just wonder, and I'm not suggesting that you stop at all, but do you feel that the most natural time for you to stop your investigating and talking about this case is if your father, if George, is convicted after his death?
Yeah, I think, it's been, so I started my investigation to show that he had nothing to do with this. I made the mistake of following the evidence, which led me, door after door kept opening, And to be clear, I loved my father. I had tremendous respect for him. He wasn't a warm fuzzy by any means, but at the same time, we'd been estranged. But when he returned after decades in Asia and his whole life, and he had, he wound up having, 11 children by 5 different women, and I was his favorite. Go figure. Well, maybe I wasn't his favorite. Maybe there was another reason why he wanted to stay close to me. He must have wondered, can you imagine the big city homicide detective as his son? What he must have thought about that. Had no clue. Anyway, he came back to San Francisco, rented a penthouse in downtown San Francisco, 39th floor, and we became close. From 1990 to 1999, when he died, he would come up and see me in Bellingham, Washington. I would go down and see him on a regular basis. And it was great to finally become close to my estranged father and get to know him better. And the man in his 70s or his 80s and 90s was not the man in his 40s and 50s. June had pretty much turned him around. No more drinking, no more 6-8 cigars a day. She had really flipped him around to where he was, and of course, the age itself, So I was very thankful to have that last decade with him. Had no clue that what would become. So now it's 27 years later, 9 books, and it's time for me to stop. I think, I'm 80, I'll be 85 in a few months. And, I'm now beginning to, I think with this, As Within, So Without, this latest book, which presents the why of his crimes, I think that's kind of the cherry on the top, so to speak. And I think it's time for me to, as my boys, my 2 sons would say, Dad, stop, you've done enough, you have grandchildren. And that's basically why I relocated back to up north here because I have one son and two grandchildren in Seattle and another son and a granddaughter in Bellingham.
Amazing.
So,
well, we hope that you do take a little break and come and visit us in the UK sometime. And
well, yeah, and I appreciate you allowing me to share. I probably cut off a lot of your questions because I have a tendency to ramble on, so to speak. But,
you answered our questions, so we didn't have to, Steve. You are perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, it was absolutely amazing. It was so lovely to speak to you. And we know that
Such an interesting person.
They're going to just absolutely be fascinated. So everyone listening, please buy his books. They are phenomenal. And yeah.
Thank you for allowing me to share it across the pond. I mean, one of my favorite times was I was actually invited to speak at Pompidou Center and present an hour and a half presentation, and with the Q&A followed. Wonderful experience at Pompidou, and that was in 2006. So a lot has happened since then.
Yeah. And we actually, when we contacted each other, when we first linked up and spoke, me and Isla, we were at CrimeCon here in the UK. I know they have one in the States. I don't know if you've ever gone to it or spoken at it, but the UK one, Isla, is often the official bookstore at the event because obviously people who have written books on their different topics are there, and people want to buy them and have the book signings. So we were actually there at the time. So it was just a lovely place to be in touch with one of our true crime heroes. That's you. And yeah, so just hopefully one day we can all share a drink together and have a chat about this and maybe some more lighthearted things.
Okay. Well, I've enjoyed my talk with you, and thanks for sharing the information. It's important that people realize that get the real story as opposed to the myths. There's a lot of myths and a lot of misinformation out there.
Absolutely. And I think that I'm going to go through your back catalogue because I've read one of your books, the one that Dee gave to me.
Black Dahlia Avenger.
Yeah, but I will be making sure the other ones are in the shop and people can come along and not only listen to the podcast, but read.
One thing you might know is I've just recently updated Black Dahlia Avenger. So this is, they'll want to get, if they want to get the book, they'll want to get this version, which came out just end of 2025. And because it's now 640 pages.
So I think it's got another 150 pages. Is that right?
Say again.
Has it got an additional 150
That's right.
pages?
Yeah, I added and tried to update a lot of the new information, including the new forensics. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, you are now an honorary Switchblade Sister in our Switchblade Sister social club. We're a bunch of misfits and weirdos, but
yeah, welcome to the club.
What can you say?
Love it.
I'll fit right in.
Yeah, we're okay with it. All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to our sexy listeners.
Steve, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.
You take care. Thanks a lot. Bye. Like this episode? Want more? Come visit me, Isla, at Criminally Good Books in the heart of York. We're an independent bookshop dedicated entirely to crime. From cosy mysteries to gritty thrillers, historical whodunits to juicy true crime. We've got signed editions, special gifts, and plenty of recommendations for your next obsession. We also host a bunch of awesome author events. Can't make it in person? Visit us online at criminallygoodbooks.co.uk.